When Steven Spielberg announced that he was adapting West Side Story for the big screen, I was very worried. Even as a self-proclaimed Spielberg stan, I couldn't imagine anyone updating a beloved text that already had a film adaptation that won Best Picture at the Oscars. Luckily, when it premiered in late 2021, I was proven wrong. The legendary filmmaker was able to breathe new life into a treasured musical while fixing all of its thematic and structural problems. Later on, when I heard that they were about to make a new version of Erich Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, I was utterly excited. West Side Story was proof that in the right hands, legendary source material could be very good when in the hands of the right filmmaker. The fact that they were finally making this iconic German story in German was good news that they were on the right path. Now that I've seen Edward Berger's new adaptation, now streaming on Netflix, I've got to say that it met every expectation that I had. I'm a huge fan of the original 1930 picture, and this one is honestly just as good. Excited to talk about All Quiet on the Western Front, I delayed my previously planned video for this month and immediately got to work in writing this visual essay. In this episode, I'll be contextualizing the history of this famous text and the films that were inspired by it. I'll begin with writer Erich Remarque's experience in the First World War, which would inspire him to write the original novel, the production of Universal's Best Picture-winning adaptation in 1930, Nazi Germany and the controversy created by the book and the movie, the 1979 TV film directed by Delbert Mann, and finally, the brilliance and improvements in Edward Berger's newly released picture. Before we begin, spoiler warning. This visual essay contains major spoilers about all three versions of All Quiet on the Western Front. I don't normally put spoiler alerts when talking about classic films, but since Edward Berger's version is brand new, it seemed right to do so. I suggest you avoid this video if you have not seen the older versions already or simply want to avoid any details about the new film. World War I is one of the most complicated wars to explain to anyone. Since I can't do it justice and talk about All Quiet on the Western Front in a short period of time, I've linked in the description below a great YouTube documentary by WarsoftheWorld who goes in depth on the subject in a simple and easy to understand way. He talks about the political situation in Europe, how the war began, and how it changed the world. If you'd like to brush up on your history, I suggest you watch it to get a better understanding. Having said that, let's jump right into All Quiet on the Western Front's cinematic journey. The year is 1916, where an 18-year-old boy named Erich Paul Remarque, he would go on to change it later to Erich Maria Remarque, is drafted into the German military alongside many of his schoolmates. At the time, he was studying to be a teacher, but like most healthy German boys his age, life was put on pause so he could go out and fight for his country. After basic military training, Remarque's unit was sent to the Western Front in Flanders, Belgium, where they took part in trench warfare. While at the front lines, the young man experienced a lot of atrocities that would leave a lasting impression on him. He starved and witnessed sickness, he lived in unsanitary conditions that most of us could never imagine, and he saw many of his boyhood friends die. This kind of trauma is more than enough to change anybody's worldview, especially during one's formative teenage years. To put it into context, Remarque was the same age as Stranger Things actor Noah Schnapp is now. So yeah, he was basically a baby. In July of 1917, Remarque was wounded after a heavy British artillery attack and was sent back to Germany for surgery and a lengthy recovery period that lasted over a year. He was sent back to active duty on October 1918, just 1 month before the war ended. After the war, Remarque returned to Germany and completed his education. He had a short-lived career as a teacher before quitting the profession in 1920. He then went through multiple odd jobs while completing his first novel, The Dream Booth. Over the next few years, he worked as a writer for a number of magazines before working on a serial called In the West, nothing new for a German newspaper. His work became so popular that it was eventually published in book form on January 31, 1929. The English translation of this book would be titled All Quiet on the Western Front. The story follows a German boy named Paul Baumer, who enlists into the army after being inspired by a series of rousing patriotic speeches given by his teacher. Along with many of his classmates, he starts off as optimistic and wide-eyed. Ultimately, that all changes when he experiences the true horrors of war. Remarque later admitted that the book was somewhat semi-autobiographical, with the character of Paul acting as his stand-in. What you read within the pages of the novel was directly inspired by his own experiences living and fighting in the trenches. Remarque, now a pacifist, also made it clear that he wasn't chastising Germany, but instead was condemning the act of war in general. In the novel's prologue, he writes, "This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure. For death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will simply try to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war." Its universal themes were embraced by the general public, who felt that Remarque's depiction of war was honest. Patrick Sauer of Smithsonian Magazine writes in his retrospective essay, "Apolitical in terms of policy and strategy, Remarque's anti-war masterpiece tapped into the global sorrow following a conflict that led to more than 17 million casualties between 1914 to 1918. The book instantly became a literary juggernaut." All Quiet on the Western Front's initial print run sold out on its release date, and by the end of the year had sold more than 1 million copies in Germany alone. Abroad, it was a big hit as well, with 800,000 copies selling in Britain, France, and the United States. In short, it was pretty much a cultural phenomenon. Everybody's father, mother, and grandma was reading Remarque's novel, including this guy, Joseph Goebbels, who plays a big part in this story later. It wasn't long after its initial publication before All Quiet on the Western Front caught the attention of Hollywood executives looking to make a film version. Remarque would eventually find his cinematic collaborators in Universal Pictures founder Carl Laemmle and his son Carl Laemmle Jr., who was appointed head of production at the studio at just 21 years old. Both Laemmles visited Germany that year to negotiate the film rights with Remarque and to assure the wary author that the Hollywood version would remain true to the spirit of the book, wrote Dr. Thomas Doherty in his book Hollywood and Hitler. On the centrality of the anti-war theme, father, son, and author were all on the same page. "The picture will bring home the useless wastefulness of war," declared Laemmle Sr., pledging to infuse the film with the spirit that moved so many to read the volume. Universal then hired Louis Milestone to helm the film. He was fresh off an Oscar win for directing 2 Arabian Nights at the first ever Academy Awards. Milestone would then cast 21-year-old unknown Lou Ayres in the starring role of Paul, to the dismay of Laemmle Jr., who wanted someone more experienced. However, the director was insistent. To him, Ayres had the right qualities for the role. He thought he was handsome, earnest, and intelligent. In addition, Milestone knew that by casting an unknown actor, audiences would see an everyday protagonist rather than be distracted by a big star. To balance Ayres' inexperience, Milestone hired veteran actor Louis Walheim for the major supporting role of Kat, an older soldier who acts as Paul's friend and mentor. As for the screenplay, the director brought in a platoon of writers to transform Remarque's literary masterpiece into a talking picture. These writers, which include Maxwell Anderson, George Abbott, Del Andrews, and C. Gardner Sullivan, restructured the book's episodic format while still emphasizing war's senseless human waste. Production began on November 18, 1929, a little over 10 months after the novel first hit shelves. The mood on set was a creative one, as Milestone and his team employed new filmmaking techniques that would forever change the way war movies are made. For instance, All Quiet on the Western Front was the first to use giant mobile cranes in talking pictures. Unlike many cameras of the time, which were usually confined in soundproof boxes, Milestone instead used mobile cameras so he could be inside the action. He would shoot many of these sequences silent, later adding the battle sounds in post-production. Ultimately, Lewis Milestone wanted All Quiet on the Western Front to feel like brutal reality. John Whiteclay Chambers writes in his paper, "Together with his cinematographer Arthur Edison, the director used a combination of fast-moving sight and sound to heighten the impact of the violence of industrialized warfare. The two men built a number of powerful images: the pockmarked landscape of no man's land, flashes of artillery fire on the horizon, wisps of smoke and gas, soldiers climbing out of trenches and rushing into machine gun fire and exploding artillery shells, bodies lying crumbled on the ground, hanging on barbed wire, or being hurled into the air by artillery blasts." While the film is almost 100 years old today, you can still see Milestone's technical brilliance in every frame. All Quiet on the Western Front is one of the most beautifully made pictures from the early years of Hollywood, perhaps of all time even. By watching it, you'll never know that it was produced in a period when filmmaking technology was relatively new, or that it was shot in Southern California and not the south of France. It's a marvel of a film that beats a lot of today's movies shot with the benefit of bigger budgets and state-of-the-art visual effects. All Quiet on the Western Front premiered in New York City on April 1930, before going wide to other cities on August of that same year. Despite the economic slump brought on by the Great Depression, audiences jammed into movie theaters. The film broke box office records, recuperating its $1.5 million budget in no time. Critics went gaga for the film as well, with reviewers singing high praises for Lewis Milestone's direction, Lou Ayres' sensitive performance, and the remarkable camera and sound work. Take, for example, this review published by Variety in May 1930. "And what a war picture without an English or American soldier in it. And the best war picture ever filmed, which is Western Front. The League of Nations could make no better investment than to buy the master print, reproduce it in every language for every nation to be shown every year until the word war shall have been taken out of the dictionaries." Here's another by New York Daily News' Irene Thyrer. "It is not only a great motion picture because it has been built firmly and consistently upon the plot of a great book. Its smack of directorial genius, nothing short of this, sensitive performances by a marvelous cast, and the most remarkable camera work which has been performed on either silent or sound screen round about the Hollywood studios. It was a financial, critical, and audience hit." By November, the third Academy Awards rolled by, and everybody inside the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles knew that the top prize would rightfully go to All Quiet on the Western Front. It would go on to win Best Picture and Best Director. Unfortunately, the film lost its bids in Best Cinematography and Best Writing. On a final note about the Oscars, Lou Ayres, who is magnetic in this film, certainly should have been up for Best Actor. It's a career-defining performance, and rightfully so. Over at Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party was rising to power. On Election Day 1930, the Nazis garnered 6.4 million votes, making them the second largest political party in the country. As Nazi ideologies began to take hold of Germany, Hitler and his media impresario, Joseph Goebbels, saw All Quiet on the Western Front as a major threat. Patrick Sauer writes, "Remarque's critically acclaimed novel, which would be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, became a proxy for Nazi rage over its portrayal of German infantrymen as dispirited and disillusioned. Hitler refused to believe Teutonic soldiers could be anything but a magnificent fighting force, a nationalistic historical rewrite that took hold amongst the battered German citizenry." Anticipating negative reception overseas, Universal sought out the help of German Consul General Otto von Hentig to guide them for a new cut for German release. They worked together to edit out a lot of anti-war themes, such as scenes showing the terrible living conditions in the muddy trenches and a particular line of dialogue blaming the Kaiser for the war. Because of the new sanitized cut, censors in Berlin cleared the movie for screening. It would have its German premiere in Berlin's Mozart Hall on December 5, 1930. As the release date approached, local policemen were tipped off that acts of violence may occur on the first day of screenings. However, nothing happened. German audiences stayed silent as the credits rolled, unsure of what to make of the film. The following day, the police had put their guard down. To everybody's surprise, 150 Nazi brown shirts stormed into the theater to create chaos. Led by Goebbels, the Nazis howled Judenfilm at the screen while setting off stink bombs and sneezing powders, releasing white mice along the aisles, and savagely beating moviegoers they thought were Jewish. The theater's management was forced to stop the show. Goebbels would gloat about the success of his attack in his diary later that evening. He then orchestrated more riots in and around theaters in Germany and Austria to build hatred against the film, which he labeled as a Jewish movie filled with anti-German propaganda. By the end of the week, the violence on the streets prompted the Supreme Court of Censors to reverse their decision, effectively banning the film in the country. 3 years later, the nation was under Hitler's reign. Goebbels had climbed the ladder of success with the new chancellor controlling propaganda, media, and entertainment under a special ministry. On the evening of May 10, 1933, the Nazis raided bookstores and libraries, gathering books that were considered un-German and damaging to Nazi ideologies. Along with other angry civilians, they burned 25,000 books that night. Among the works put to the flame was Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. By the end of the year, it was officially illegal to own the book and its sequel, The Road Back. Citizens were required to hand over their private copies to the Gestapo. Remarque would flee to Switzerland. Before moving on, it's important to note that this historical event played a large role in how people viewed the 1930 film version of All Quiet on the Western Front. The sanitized version, edited for German audiences, was passed around for years. Many European viewers saw this cut and never truly experienced what Milestone and Universal had originally intended. The studio was also wary about isolating other markets around the world, resulting into the creation of other cuts catering to different countries. For instance, the French version showed in 1930 omitted several scenes, including a powerful segment in which Paul kills a French soldier. There were countless other versions circulating until home video became a norm. The widely available copy that today's moviegoers have seen is the 133-minute version restored by the Library of Congress in 2006. While I think this particular cut is already a masterpiece, I hope that one day the original 152-minute Lewis Milestone cut is released for cinephiles to relish. By the late 1970s, producer Norman Rosemont was ready to bring All Quiet on the Western Front back to screens, but this time for the small screen. Rosemont was known in the industry for his television projects, which were usually based on classical novels that had previously been made into films during the golden age of Hollywood. On his resume were TV versions of Great Expectations and The Man in the Iron Mask. Together with British film magnate Sir Lou Grade, they planned to upgrade Remarque's novel into a nearly 3-hour Technicolor spectacle to be aired on the CBS television network in the United States. Remarque, who had passed away almost a decade earlier due to heart failure, left the rights of the book to his widow, actress Paulette Goddard. The producers purchased the rights from her for a reported $100,000. Production soon began with the Oscar-winning Delbert Mann helming the project. The director, who made his name in television, cast former Marty collaborator Ernest Borgnine for the role of the older soldier Cat, while 28-year-old Emmy winner Richard Thomas was tapped to step into the shoes of Paul. From the beginning of production, the creative team behind the 1979 TV version wanted to be more faithful to the source material than its 1930 predecessor. For instance, Paul's first-person narration is reinstated and used throughout the entire picture, allowing audiences a better understanding of his inner feelings. Screenwriter Paul Monash also restored the novel's episodic intensity by adding back Remarque's use of flashbacks. Delbert Mann told the New York Times in an on-set interview, "We have more time now. The show will run 3 hours on television to tell more of the original story." With the gift of a longer runtime, Mann was able to include sequences originally omitted in the classic film, including a scene in which a blind soldier tries to commit suicide by driving a fork into his chest, and a disturbing scene in which a young German soldier dies from a gas attack. John Whiteclay Chambers writes, Delbert Mann sought a harder edge and even more gruesome detail than the 1930 classic, drawing on standard techniques of late 20th century American action movies, rapid cutting, extreme close-ups, as well as assault on the senses by intensified battle noise and excruciating specificity of blood and gore, including impacting bullets, retching gas victims, gaping wounds and flowing blood, rat-besieged corpses, and incinerating flamethrowers, all in vivid color. When the film aired in November of 1979, most American critics celebrated the film, noting that it was just as good as Lewis Milestone's 1930 version. However, European critics who saw the film in a limited theatrical run in 1980 called the film uninspired. While I do think the Delbert Mann version is a very good movie, I personally think that it pales in comparison to the earlier 1930 picture. Hear me out. First and foremost, I feel that the movie is a little bit miscast. Ernest Borgnine, as talented as he is, feels completely out of place in this. He acts and looks like an American GI when All Quiet on the Western Front is very much a German story. Richard Thomas suffers from the same fate, but it's a little bit more passable because he looks the part. While the same critique can be said about the all-American cast of the 1930 version, it was a lot more distracting here because Mann surrounds his two main actors with an ensemble of young men with varying accents. Some have posh British accents, another has an Australian accent, and someone else has a Cockney accent. I know this is such a small thing to complain about, and filmmakers still do it a lot today, but it was just something that pulled me out of the film's reality. It often reminded me that I was watching actors act in a movie. Luckily, most of the ensemble, Borgnine and Thomas included, did marvelous work. Except maybe this guy.
Put them up under the bed, please. Hide them. You know, they stole my watch.
Whose death scene was so cringeworthy, I was like... I also felt that the film lacked the visual flair of the original movie. With technology considerably better than the 1930s, you'd expect eye-popping visuals from the production design all the way down to the visual effects. The original film was able to make California look like France, while this version made the actual Eastern Front look like a backlot in California. And let's not use the fact that it was a TV movie as an excuse because they had the budget and the talent behind the camera. Don't get me wrong, I like this version, but with such a wonderful adaptation preceding it, it's really hard not to compare the two. For the record, I give this movie a very solid 8 out of 10 despite my small problems with it. Some positive things I personally like about this version include the soulful lead performance of Richard Thomas, who despite being a lot older than his character, truly embodies the innocence and fear of Paul. The added scenes are heartbreaking and gives the audience a better understanding of the atrocities these young boys experienced. Finally, I like the ending shot, which smartly did not try to remake the iconic butterfly scene in the original movie. Instead, Delbert Mann creates a new image of Paul's lifeless body falling into the mud, an homage to Remarque's cryptic conclusion in the novel. While All Quiet 1979 doesn't hold a candle to Universal's Best Picture winning classic, the film still plays an important role in the history of its source material. It introduced Remarque's powerful anti-war story to a whole new generation. Several public elementary schools even issued study guides for the film, and students were encouraged to catch it on television. The movie was also embraced by award-giving bodies in Hollywood. It garnered 7 Emmy nominations and took home the award for Best Film Editing for a limited series or a special. In the 1980 Golden Globes, it won Best Motion Picture Made for Television. If you haven't seen this version, it's very much worth checking out. And good news, it's available for free on YouTube. I've included a link to the film in the description below. Edward Berger is a German director and screenwriter mostly known for his small dramas and TV work abroad, like his Emmy-nominated work on the limited series Patrick Melrose starring Benedict Cumberbatch. When his good friend, producer Matley Grunert, approached him to direct the first German adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front, Berger felt a surge of inspiration. He told several interviewers, "I can't believe I hadn't thought about it before." Berger then went home to seek the advice of his family/artistic council. "As soon as I mentioned the title, my daughter reacted," he told Cine Europa. She said she had just read the novel at school, that she had been moved to tears by it, and that I absolutely had to make this film. For me, it was a confirmation that the novel hasn't lost any of its impact. Another reason that inspired Berger to make the picture was the opportunity to tell a story through the perspective of a German soldier in an honest way. He notes that American and British war films always celebrate their soldier characters as heroes, while Germans were often seen as the exact opposites, the villains of the story. In our national psyche, there is nothing but guilt, horror, terror, and destruction, and we have ourselves to blame for that, he told The Hollywood Reporter. "It's not like someone attacked us, it's our own fault. I think that makes us look at war differently. There's nothing heroic about it, nothing great about it. So, doing a war film as a German means looking at it differently. There are no heroes in war. Every death is a terrible death. I thought sharing this perspective might be interesting for other countries as well, countries that might see war differently." When it came to casting the role of Paul, Berger hired 24-year-old Austrian stage actor Felix Kammerer, who had never made a movie. In fact, Kammerer was the first actor he looked at when one of the producer's wives showed him a photo of the young man. "I looked at everyone. I saw 400, 500 kids, and he was the one that just came back to our minds," said Berger in an interview about the casting process. "We invited him 4 or 5 times, and in the end, we just knew. I knew it in the beginning somehow, but we wanted to make sure and test everyone." For the major supporting role of Kat, Berlin Alexanderplatz actor Albert Schuck was cast. He told different interviewers that he liked the idea of making a war film that showed no form of heroism. By all accounts, the making of this film wasn't easy. Aiming to be as historically accurate as they could be, the filmmakers noted the difficulties of shooting in cold weather in period-appropriate attire. For instance, the felt uniforms worn by the soldiers became extremely heavy when they were wet with rain and mud. Moving around in the man-made trenches in the Czech Republic location was also a challenge for the filmmakers, who were keen on using mainly practical visual effects for most of the shots. With the support of their financial backers at Netflix, the production team carried on and created one of the most visually striking and technically beautiful films of 2022. Beyond the film's stunning technical achievements is the brilliant changes that Berger and his co-screenwriters made to the source material. Before going into this film, my greatest fear is that it would be too similar to what they had done before. The 1930 and 1979 versions are generally very similar in terms of narrative structure, sometimes even using the exact same dialogue. However, Berger doesn't do this at all. In fact, All Quiet on the Western Front 2022 is extremely different from the previous two films. The director admits that it was his goal not to do the same things Louis Milestone and Delbert Mann did. To achieve this, he never watched the 1979 version, and when he did rewatch the 1930 film, he stopped writing the script for several weeks so that he could distance his mind from the Best Picture-winning classic. Berger's efforts paid off because his version of All Quiet on the Western Front feels entirely brand new. The director had no interest in following Remarque's story to a T, but instead put his attention into Paul's journey and loss of innocence. He told interviewers that what the book did so well was put readers into Paul's shoes. This became his guiding light on how to frame the entire story narratively and visually. For every visual decision, it was important to me to put the viewer in the shoes of Paul, the main character. I wanted to make the feel physically tangible, as if you were going through it with him, to almost feel it physically. Every decision made with the camera was driven by that intent. Every angle, every position. What does Paul feel right now? That's what we wanted to capture. Once I took up this perspective of the German soldier, it wasn't difficult, because it is a new perspective. We've had the American, the English perspective on war, but somehow the German perspective on these battles, on this devastation, hadn't been seen before. I felt relatively free visually. We have a hero who is not a hero at all, just a protagonist who guides us through the film. Overall, I think Berger succeeds in this. You can feel Paul's pain. You feel exhausted when he's exhausted. You feel emotionally ruined when he is. You feel happy when he's finally able to eat. You smell the perfume whenever he takes a whiff of that French girl's handkerchief. Luckily for the director, he hired the right actor for the part. For my money, Felix Kammerer is the best Paul the Silver Screen has ever seen. I am stunned and very impressed that this was his first film role ever, because he carries the movie like a seasoned vet. It's a wonderful awards-worthy work from a new talent, and I cannot wait to see what he does next. With the character of Paul as his main concern, Berger gave himself the freedom to deviate from the original text and the old movies. He changes quite a bit of what happens, yet stays true to Remarque's anti-war message. For instance, he completely cuts out the scenes with Paul's family, as well as the extended sequences in basic military training. We also don't get Paul's cheeky meeting with the French village girls or a stint at the hospital after being injured in battle. The filmmaker also adds a lot of new things, such as Paul stealing poultry from a local French farm, that plays a huge role in the plot later on in the film, and his tragic discovery of a mass grave after a gas attack. However, the biggest change that Berger did was to create a subplot revolving around a real-life political figure named Matthias Erzberger, played by Daniel Bruhl, who was responsible for negotiating and signing the armistice between France and Germany. I've seen many reviewers criticize this as an unnecessary addition to the story. However, for me, it adds a lot more context into Paul's tragic story. By contrasting young boys dying at the front with German politicians living in luxury, Berger adds another layer of complexity. The director says that more than 100 years later, we now see the events of World War I in completely different eyes. History has told us that the lives of millions of boys like Paul could have been spared if it weren't for the egos of top politicians. By adding this subplot, the audience is given one of the most heart-wrenching and tragic finales in cinema this year. I don't really want to get into it or spoil anything, but who knew that a ticking pocket watch could make your nerves jump? Overall, I really love this new version of All Quiet on the Western Front. I've been waiting for it for more than a year, and I can happily say that I'm very satisfied with the end results. I think the film is visually captivating and gorgeously made without sacrificing any of the emotional beats of the story. Berger and his co-screenwriters have done a wonderful job adapting Remarque's source material for a new audience, and I truly hope that it once again sparks meaningful discussions about the horrors of war. Especially now, with a war ongoing in Europe, the story feels more relevant than ever. Before ending this episode, I'd just like to recommend a few other World War I set films that I love. The first is 1957's Paths of Glory, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas. The film tells the story of French soldiers on trial for cowardice. As you'd expect from Kubrick, the film is a visual masterpiece and includes wonderful performances from all his actors. Also, check out David Lean's 1965 masterpiece Dr. Zhivago if you haven't already. While there's very little trench warfare here, the film follows the romance of a young doctor named Yuri Zhivago and a political activist's wife called Lara who struggles during World War I and the Russian Revolution. I also really loved A Very Long Engagement from 2004. Starring Audrey Tautou and the late great Gaspard Ulliel, the film follows a woman who relentlessly searches for her young fiancé who disappears from the trenches. Finally, I highly encourage you to check out Peter Jackson's 2018 documentary They Shall Not Grow Old, which I watched for the first time in preparation for this episode. Jackson and his filmmaking team have painstakingly restored and colorized vintage war footage to show modern-day audiences what life was like as an English soldier during the Great War. It's one of the very best films of its year. And of course, watch all the versions of All Quiet on the Western Front and bask in its rich cinematic history that has spanned almost 100 years.